Second part of a study begun this morning in the prophet Micah. When my little boy asked me last evening, what I was preaching on today, I told him Micah. He wanted to know who Micah was. And I tried to explain that Micah is the prophet who saw that Jesus was going to be born in the town of Bethlehem. That nearly 800 years before it happened, God gave this prophet the news that this would indeed occur. We indicated this morning that the prophecy of Micah can be broken into three parts. Chapters 1 and 2, which speak of punishment coming upon Micah's land, the country of Judah, and the promise that concluded that series in regard to punishment. In chapters 3, 4, and 5, second part of the book of Micah, which we look at now, is the theme which Micah gives of hope beyond affliction. And then the last part of the book, chapters 6 and 7, speaks of grace being triumphant over sin. You will notice as you read the prophets, by the way, that there is a good deal of repetition. Themes have a way of coming up again and again. For example, Micah continually in these sections gives a rather lengthy judgment of God upon the nation for its sins, but he will always conclude with a section of promise. And in both the section of judgment and the section of promise, there are overlapping ideas and communication which is made. We read the prophets, of course, as a finished product. When we read Micah, it's to us as if at one point in his life he stood up and he began to speak, and he spoke for about 30 minutes, and out came 7 chapters. It wasn't, however, quite that way. For what is contained in this book may represent a lifetime of ministry, or it may represent years of ministry, or it may simply only represent weeks of ministry. It contains really the nutshell of his message to the people. And I think we would do violence to the prophetic word if we would assume that it was a sermon or a book simply written on one occasion. Out of Micah's life came the flow of words, which he preached verbally over a course of time, emphasizing theme after theme. And finally, when his verbal message is completed, there comes the moment when the Spirit of God quickens him and causes him to reduce his verbal message to writing. This is because in God's design, he wanted us to have it. For Micah, you see, is our prophet, and his book belongs in our lives. As Micah in this section on hope and affliction, chapters 3 through 5, writes, he first of all speaks in chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 5, verse 6, of the doom and destiny of the city of Jerusalem. His message, of course, is occurring in Jerusalem, and there is a great deal of history yet to be tied up within this city. We know a great deal of history past. As Micah looks at the Jerusalem of his day in chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, he brings, first of all, a message of punishment against the city. He condemns the courts, the prophets, and the establishment in these 12 verses for their perversion of justice. Look for a moment at what he says against the courts. He introduces them not with the word courts, but with the term heads of Jacob. Heads of Jacob standing for family representative heads, rulers. It is the purpose in Micah's view, and indeed the view of Scripture, the purpose of government, to be the guardian of justice. And when justice is not guarded in society by the government, then law certainly breaks down. As Micah looks at the judges, he says, their justice is a matter of butchery. They flay the skin off the poor. They eat the flesh of my people. They grind them up at the meat grinders, chop them up, throw them in the kettle, and boil them like flesh in a cauldron. If you cannot get justice in the courts, is what he is saying. And he indicates that as a punishment against the judges, there will come a day when they themselves will cry out to the Lord, but he will not answer. And he will hide his face from these judges in the time of their travail, because they made their deeds evil. This is a theme also stated in Proverbs chapter 21, verse 13, where Solomon indicates, the man who shuts his ears to the cries of the poor will get no answer when he cries out for himself. It is the theme of, if you do not dispense mercy, then how can you receive mercy? Against the prophets, Micah also cries out in verses 5 through 8. His basic complaint against the prophets is that they have a favorite sermon. In fact, it is a sermon with a one-word title. It is a sermon which they preach over and over again, perhaps using different illustrations, but always it is the same theme. It is the word shalom, a word which in the Hebrew stands for the idea everything is going to come out all right. God's best is coming your way. It's a wonderful day, and you can live and do as you want. It's wonderful. And peace, shalom. Micah says this message, which only emphasizes the loving kindness of God and does not come to grips with evil and with sin and with the necessity for straightening out your life, this kind of a message is basically coming from those who are speaking for hire. That is, it is a position which they enjoy through the financial support of others. And he says those who come only with the message of shalom, everything is going to be all right, and never come with a word of rebuke, never come with the word of the Lord which roots us out and finds us at our level of sin and our need for correction, that there is going to come a time of darkness upon these prophets, where in the past they have divined and made out the future, in the day to come they are to have no revelation at all. He is saying false prophets are in it for profit. In contrast, he indicates of himself that the true prophet speaks of justice, and he can be known to be a true prophet because he distinguishes between the right and the wrong, because he is filled with the Spirit of God, because he declares sin. In verses 9 through 12, in his message of punishment upon Jerusalem, he also speaks against the establishment, the state, the church. He says, "Hear this, you heads of the house of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, who abhor justice and pervert all equity, who build Zion with blood." Now you must remember that here in Micah's time, great buildings already exist. The Temple of Solomon is a century and a half, at least 2 centuries now, rather, in terms of its glory. There is a great building that is taking place, building religious, building secular-wise, and Micah is saying, what is all this building that people are glorying in? Look at the kinds of wages the laborers have been paid to build it. And Micah cannot sit back and simply enjoy the architectural splendor that is arising on the skyline of Jerusalem when he considers the kind of human cost that has been involved in the construction of the city. Therefore, he says, in a reaction to evil that is occurring within Jerusalem, a kind of a bombshell for his audience. Verse 12, "Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be as a plowed field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house, that is the temple, a wooded height." All the buildings which are seen, the temple of the Lord, which was taken to be inviolable, that is, it could not be destroyed. No one would touch it. The Lord would guard it. It was kind of like saying there will come a day when the Capitol and the White House will be no more, and it will be an open field and a wasteland. It is as if we would put Micah in the modern scene, as if he stood before the headquarters of his denomination and said, these buildings will stand no more because of the sin which is present, and they will all be wiped away. It was not a message of comfort. It was not a message which brought Micah a great deal of popularity. In fact, so great was the bombshell of the message that in giving it, his own life was endangered. I'm always struck as I read the Scriptures that words that I read easily and fall rather glibly across my mind were words which, when first delivered, came at the very cost of one's life. And that when Micah deliberated in giving verse 12, which the Spirit had given to him, he knew that he took a calculated risk. That once he delivered it, his own life was in danger. We know that his life was in danger because in one of those interesting crossover references in the Old Testament, we come to the prophet Jeremiah a century later, Jeremiah chapter 26. And Jeremiah in his day, a century down the road, was saying the same thing as Micah. He was saying, God is going to destroy the city and the temple is going to lay in ruins. An attempt was made against his life. And the only thing that saved him was that some of the counselors to the king came along and said, didn't Micah say this same thing a century ago? And did the king then, even though he didn't like his words, move to destroy him? No, because he was the prophet of God, he let him live. So Jeremiah was allowed to live because Micah had gotten away with it a century earlier. But another prophet in that same chapter, in Jeremiah 26, who didn't have the stature of a Jeremiah, said the same thing as Jeremiah, and he was put to death. These were incendiary words. This prophecy, by the way, which Micah gives here in verse 12, is so graphically fulfilled and represented in Psalm 79, verse 1, where the psalmist laments after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, O God, the heathen have come into thine inheritance. They have defiled thy holy temple. They have laid Jerusalem in ruins. I think it is one thing for us to look back upon the panorama of prophecy and look at a passage such as 3:12 in Micah and say, oh yes, it was fulfilled. And we find its fulfillment in Psalm 79, verse 10. And we need to, however, press beyond that kind of a perception to say of the prophecies that are still living and have not yet been fulfilled, that one day in a point of time, we will look back upon the prophecies that have not yet come to pass, and we'll be able to date as well and say, oh yes, every word which God's Word declared did have its final destiny, its moment of conclusion. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 8, there is still a discussion of the doom and destiny of Jerusalem, but this time the picture changes, and Micah sees Jerusalem in its future greatness. It is a time when God is finished with His judgment upon His people. And in the city and in the temple, where previously in Micah's day, in the day of the prophets, God had been allowed to rule in name only, the time will come when He will rule in reality, and when He will be truly honored and obeyed. And from the picture of pilgrims coming to the festival at Jerusalem and ascending Mount Zion to worship and bring their sacrifices at the temple, Micah draws the theme of the nations of the earth pouring into Mount Zion and to Jerusalem to offer their sacrifices to God. In verses 1 and the first part of verse 2 in chapter 4, he pictures the flow of pilgrims into Jerusalem and the mountain of the house of the Lord being elevated above the mountains of the earth. Now, I guess you can take this literally or figuratively. If you take it literally, you have Mount Zion being about 30,000 feet in the air, which is going to be rough for anybody except a Hillary to climb it, to offer any sacrifices to the Lord. It's probably a prophetic way of saying that the most important place in the world will be the Temple of Jerusalem. We may understand this prophecy, of course, as being referring to that age when Christ will literally rule on the earth. But we also may take it already in a spiritual sense to say that the church had its beginning in Jerusalem. That on the day of Pentecost, the pilgrims had flowed into the city of Jerusalem, and God's Spirit was outpoured, and Jesus' resurrection was first proclaimed. That the nations flowed into the city and heard of the elevation of Jesus at Mount Zion in the very temple area itself. And from that flowing in, there came a flowing out, and the word of the Lord went forth. Even as Micah certainly says in the latter part of verse 2 and on through verse 4, that from the mountain of the Lord, from the temple, would go forth the law of the Lord, and he would teach men His ways. Finally, what comes from Jerusalem eventually is that peace will exist among the nations. Those who have swords will turn them into plowshares, and those who have spears will turn them into pruning hooks, and there shall be no lifting up of swords by nations anymore against each other. You look at discussions today on disarmament, and you know what a terrible problem the nations have in disarming. No one has yet come up with a way to uninvent war. Here, however, is that beautiful picture of prophecy which says to us that when God reigns physically on the earth, war is laid aside. He will do what men cannot do. And fittingly, Jerusalem, which in Micah's day had been known for its injustice and its oppression of the poor, will in the day of the Lord become known for its justice. He will decide among the nations. And in verse 4, the ideal will come to pass. They shall sit, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. Is that a kind of an imagery that makes you all tingling inside? How would you like to sit under your vine and under your fig tree? Does that do anything for you? Or are you like me? You don't particularly like figs, and seedless grapes are okay. Under your vine and under your fig tree. Yet this was an ideal which was stated, for example, during the great reign of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 35. The tranquility of Solomon's reign is described as, and Judah and Israel dwelt in safety, from Dan, the north, to Beersheba, the south, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. And there never was a time in the nation's history when they came even close to that again. What it's suggesting is a beautiful pastoral scene. Every person has their little bit of property, their little house, their cozy house on that property, their veranda, the shade of their vine, the shade of their fig tree, and that is a kind of an image of success that is presented. Not some corporate success which finds one ruling over an empire, not being able to extravagantly use means to pursue things that don't even bring joy in the last analysis, but a picture of the fact that the real joys of life in their last analysis are very simple. And sometimes we strive too hard to be happy, even on vacation. We strive too hard to see too much, so we'll make sure that we milk the last ounce of joy out of our vacation. every man under his vine and under his fig tree. A real peace. And also, as Micah contemplates this, he says in verse 5, "In the meantime, while the nations walk each in the name of their God, let us walk in the name of the Lord our God." While we're waiting for this blessed event to happen, let's walk with the Lord. And let's also remember, he is saying, that in that day in Jerusalem and in Judah, the remnant will be regathered. They will be lame, but he will heal the lame, and he will make them reign in Zion. There's a beautiful spiritual fulfillment, of course, in this when Jesus comes and begins his fundamental ministry of healing the paralyzed, the lame. In chapter 4, verse 9 through 5-6, still dealing with the theme of Jerusalem's doom and destiny, Micah gives a set of 3 prophecies, each of which emphasizes the theme of the distress within the city and a deliverance for the city. And in each of these 3 sets, chapter 4, verses 9 and 10 is the first set, 11 through 13 the second set, and 5, 1 through 6, the third little prophecy about Jerusalem. In each one, he speaks of a different kind of distress and a different sort of affliction. And it is in the last of these 3 sets that he speaks of Bethlehem, and from that we have the prophecy of Bethlehem, which we encounter in the Gospel of Matthew. Each of the sets of prophecies about Jerusalem begins with the word now. Look at verse 9, now. Verse 11, now. In chapter 5, verse 1, now. In the first prophecy of distress and deliverance for Jerusalem, he harkens back to the idea of being made a captive in Babylon and then coming back. Here, by the way, is a striking thing. It would almost go past us if we weren't made to stop for a moment and reckon historically with where we're at. Micah is living in a time in which the invading power is Assyria. He is living in the early part, or the latter part, rather, of the 8th century before Christ. It will be 130 years after Micah that his nation will finally fall. But it will not fall to the power of Assyria. It will fall to the power of Babylon, which on the world stage is not even yet a power when Micah writes. Yet he accurately prophesies that his country, Judah, will not fall to the Assyrians, but rather it will fall into captivity to Babylon. And that when its place in Babylon is done, it will be rescued, for the Lord will redeem it. In his second poem about the distress and deliverance of Jerusalem, he indicates that those nations which gather against Jerusalem and gaze upon it, and with the idea of profaning the city and using their weapons of war as a threshing device to grind the people of God into the dust, that they who had this intention for others will themselves be brought to that same kind of fate. And in chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, the prophecy which is for us the center of the book of Micah, he contrasts the present king of Jerusalem when he is writing with a glorious future king which shall come to Jerusalem. He says in chapter 5, verse 1, "Now you are walled about with a wall. Siege is laid against us." Perhaps here he is writing in the moment when Hezekiah has been laid siege by the king Sennacherib of Assyria. We know about this invasion both from the Bible and from secular accounts from Assyrian writings which come down from the period, where Sennacherib describes how he shut up King Hezekiah like a bird in the cage, how he took town after town, in fact 46 different towns within Judah, and how he took many captives. But in a moment of time, the siege was broken. He heard a rumor of war. An angel of the Lord also intervened into the camp of the Assyrians, and Jerusalem itself did not fall. But in this siege, the king of Judah, Hezekiah, looks very weak. And Micah prophetically says, in a poetic kind of a way, with a rod they strike the cheek of the ruler of Israel. But when you strike someone with a rod on the cheek, it's a real sign of affront. If I came up to you and slapped you with my hand, I doubt if you'd come back here to church next Sunday. But if you're a king, you have power, and someone does not come up to a king if he fears for his life and clap him over the chops. The fact that he can be hit suggests that he is in a position of tremendous weakness. And the fate of the king and the people are inevitably bound together. When the people are weak, the king is also weak. When the king is weak, the people are weak. Because Israel's destiny was wrapped up with its king. Likewise, when its king is strong, its people are strong. So with the present fate of having their king affronted by Assyrian power, Micah leaps on to the cradle of the Davidic dynasty,
the cradle of the kings, Bethlehem, and says in a future moment, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose origin is from of old, from ancient days." Stop at that for just a moment, because the prophet is saying more than even he realizes. He's saying something about the eternality of the one who will come from David's seed. He certainly is also hearkening back to the truth, according to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 12, that the line of David began in Bethlehem. David's father Jesse lived in Bethlehem. David was born in Bethlehem. And in that little, insignificant, out-of-the-way place from which no one would ever guess anything significant would come, out of the cradle of Bethlehem would come, first of all, King David. And later the dynasty would be revived in that very same town. A future David, a greater than David, David's son, who would also be David's Lord, would also come, and he would take the kingdom. It is a tremendously thrilling prophecy, which was so accurate that even those who were the scholars and advisors to Herod knew where to look for the birthplace of the Jewish king. It is said of him, "Therefore God shall give Judah up until the time when she who is in travail has brought forth." Mary, being in travail, brought forth Jesus. "Then the rest of his brethren shall return to the people of Israel." By the way, we're some of that, brethren. We're in that prophecy, because the New Testament says that once we've come to Jesus Christ, we are now an heir with the Jews to the promises made to Abraham. So you can put yourself right in the Old Testament. He, when he came, caused us to return. "And he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth." That is a prophecy which already is coming to pass spiritually, but yet will even have a physical dimension to its fulfillment in the time when the Lord literally reigns on the earth. Verses 5 through 6 is somewhat difficult to interpret, for there's first of all the RSV probable botching of the translation, which makes it difficult to understand, and Micah does a difficult play on words as well, but he speaks also of this one who's going to be born in Bethlehem as to what his role is going to be in regard to the Assyrian threat. He says, and the RSV begins in verse 5 by saying, "And this shall be the peace." A better alternative would be, "And this is the one who will bring peace." And then for a moment, think of the phrase which begins with "when," all the way through the word "sword" in verse 6 as being separated by a great parenthesis. The sentence would read something like this: "This is the one who will bring the peace, and he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and treads within our border." The phrase in parenthesis, "when the Assyrian comes into our land and treads upon our soil, we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men, and they shall rule the land of Assyria with the sword," is evidently Micah's way of quoting a current battle song that was circulating in Judah, saying, here's our idea of deliverance. We'll raise up plenty of leaders, we'll pull back Assyria, and we'll rule over them. It is a song which commentators feel that the Judean patriot was singing. We'll lick him, we've got plenty of leaders, we'll take care of him. And against that song, and by way of contrast, Micah says, the one who will come will be the peace, and he will bring the peace, and he will deliver us from the Assyrians. Now, there's a striking thing that happens here as you look at the book of Kings, which describes this invasion, and that is that an angel of the Lord comes, or the angel of the Lord comes against the Assyrians and routs the Assyrian army with great loss to the Assyrians. In the Old Testament, whenever the phrase "the angel of the Lord" is used, many think it to be an appearance of Jesus Christ before he came in the flesh. For the angel of the Lord is worshipped, and no angels can be worshipped. The angel of the Lord speaks on behalf of God, and a number of things are associated with the angel of the Lord. So we may well see here in Micah's expectation the fact that the Lord makes his appearance as the angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, to bring deliverance for Jerusalem from the Assyrians. But what a tremendous contrast between their current king, Hezekiah, and their future king, the Lord, who will be their shepherd, their king, and their deliverer. In verses 7 through 9 of chapter 5, Micah then, in regard to the destiny of Jerusalem, speaks of the role of the remnant, which will come back from the many lands where they have been exiled, and they will be a blessing to the peoples of the world. He also indicates in verses 10 through 15 that God in his day of arrival, when the day begins for his reign to be assumed, will bring judgment upon Israel and upon the nations. He will take away those things which are wrong, and he will put in their place those things which are right. He will take away the images which are false and bring the true conception of himself. You know, as I was looking at this particular phrase of God's describing himself in verse 13 of chapter 5 as cutting off your images, we know that the children of Israel in the Old Testament had a real problem with false representations of God. And they made things out of wood, they made things out of metal, they made things out of stone to represent God in precise disobedience to the commandment of not making any graven images. But you and I think, know that it is just as possible to make mental images of God which are wrong as it is possible to make metal images of God which are wrong. And if the metal images of God distort our concept of God and therefore destroy our true concept of ourself and ruin us, it is so also that a wrong mental concept of God also destroys us. A concept, for example, that God is all overbearing and no love, and will not forgive us and will not help us, will destroy any confidence we have that God is for us. On the other hand, a mental concept of God that everything is sugar sweet and okay and one does whatever he wants and there's never any reckoning or accounting for what one has done will also work severe damage to our spiritual life. As we look at the Scripture, we are able to lay aside false mental and mental images of the Lord. Briefly, in chapters 6 and 7, Micah comes to the third part of his written message, where he speaks of grace being triumphant over sin. In chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 7, he gives messages of reproof and lament. He takes up, as he did, and we saw this morning in chapter 1, a court case against Israel for its sin. He introduces the court case by pleading to the mountains and the hills to give witness to what was happening in regard to the controversy the Lord had against his people. Here again, we should not simply let words go by us without meditating upon their meaning. Have you ever gone in a valley? Have you gotten out of the city recently at all? And just walked in kind of an open area and stood back and looked at the beauty of the hills and gotten the feel for the solidness of the earth once more? I have done this many times and looked at the hills and thought how many generations they have witnessed and what scenes they have seen, which I will never see. Micah here is saying the mountains which loom over the valleys and which are witnesses, silent witnesses of nature to all the events that have gone on down below. They have truly seen everything. So when he begins his court case against Israel in this particular section, he is calling the mountains to bear witness against the people of God. And he is saying to the mountains, hear the controversy which the Lord has against his people. The controversy is this: what have I done to you? In what way have I wearied you? Answer me. God's controversy is the fact that his people have left him and left him for no good reason. He did nothing to merit this kind of betrayal, this kind of removal from his presence. And if we understand anything about God from the prophets, we certainly saw it in Hosea, is God is sharply wounded and grieved when he is betrayed. When he has made friends with us and we have been his own, and when we leave him, it hurts him more than you can describe. Have you ever had someone who is very close to you, who has so disappointed you, who has turned from you, or who has betrayed you? And you have a feeling in your heart which alternates between the Christian recognition to forgive and to love them nevertheless, and on the other hand, the retaliation kind of a feeling to get even with them. Because one has been hurt so badly, one hardly knows what to do. It's how God feels toward us when we leave him, when we betray him, when we go astray. God has a case against his people. And he reminds them of the things which he has done for them. Verses 4 and 5 are particularly dramatic. I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of bondage. I set before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, all my people. Remember what Balak, king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him. This was the attempt to prophesy against Israel, which was thwarted. And what happened from Shittim to Gilgal. Now here are two references which are very important, because Shittim was the last place which Israel encamped at before they crossed the Jordan, and Gilgal was the first place they crossed after the Jordan. And when they came to the Jordan, Joshua, now the new leader of the people, smote the waters of the Jordan, and they rolled up on either side, and it was again, like the Exodus, a great act of God. And the waters of the Jordan were smitten that you might know the saving acts of God. Don't you remember this? Micah is pleading with his people. And as I thought about this accusation which Micah makes, I thought of my own life. How easily at times I forget what God has done for me. I get in some new jam, some new test so fierce that I've never been like this in this kind of a situation I feel any other time in my life. And it's so easy in that kind of a situation to lose a sense of destiny, to lose a sense of what God has done for you at some previous time, to count it off as some ancient history or even fantasy. But God wants His people to remember what He has done for them, and He wants you to remember what He has done for you. And when we begin with describing what Jesus has done for us, we of course begin with the cross and with the empty tomb. But we go on from that to relate instances in our own life where God has met us. Judah, when it comes to grips with the emotion that God feels for the betrayal which he has suffered, begins to say, what can we do about it now? So in verses 6 and 7, they come up with traditional means of trying to make peace with God. If we give God a gift, maybe we can get it off of our conscience. Let's see. Let's get something out of our wallet and put it in the offering, and maybe God will feel better about this whole deal. When all along, what He does not want is our things. What He simply wants is us. In verse 6, he says, Don't bring me the quality of offerings. It's not the quality of offerings that I want. Do you want to bring me a whole burnt offering? That was an expensive offering. That meant when you brought a whole burnt offering, that the animal which you brought was all going to be burned up. And whereas in some of the other offerings, you got some of it back to eat yourself and go home to your family with, the whole burnt offering was all God's. And that's an expensive offering to give a bull to the Lord. Maybe you haven't done that recently. When the Lord rejects the quality of their offering, and even a calf a year old, I mean, it doesn't cost one that much to give God a calf that's only a few days old, because after all, He hasn't eaten much of our oats yet. But when you have to feed the crazy thing for a whole year, then you're saying, Lord, I've got a year's investment in this animal. Will you take him? God says, no, that's not what I want. Well, God, if you don't want quality, maybe you want quantity. Let's see, God, how about thousands of rams? And whereas normally in the offering there was a little measure of oil that was placed in the offering, how about 10,000s of rivers of oil? And I'll give you my firstborn, my own son, the fruit of my body for my sin. God, I'll give you the best and I'll give you the most. Don't we try to do that sometimes with God when we've come to our senses and realize we've been unfaithful? Lord, I'll get busy for you now. See, how many activities can I now do for you? How much can I do? The Lord, of course, simply says, first of all, I just want you. And I want you to begin walking rightly. I don't want all the things that are the trappings. I want your real self. Micah responds by saying, He has showed you, O man, what is good, and what the Lord does require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. That phrase, to love kindness, is important, for kindness is the word in the Hebrew hesed. Hesed. It stands for the loving kindness of God. It is a word which is much stronger than the word love. It really carries the concept of love-loyalty. It is so deep that it will always be true. And the Lord is saying of His people, what I simply ask of you is a loyalty, love, which is always there. Justice and humility. Micah then returns to the theme of the sin of the people. He talks about commercial sins, the trickery of persons who are defrauding others of what is theirs, using wrong weights, scant measures, living in houses which are built off of tyranny, speaking lies. And because of this, he indicates God is going to move and deal out penalties. In fact, the penalty is going to be so severe that not only will they enjoy what they had, all their lives they've saved to get all of these things, and when at last all of the things are gathered, they're not going to be able to enjoy them at all. How descriptive, by the way, that still is of so much of modern life. One works like crazy to get things all of one's life, only to reach an age when either one is too old or sick to enjoy them, or the children which have been under our feet which were sacrificed for the pursuit of things, are now around no more, and no one is close to us anymore. And the thing which we thought we would enjoy in our old age has all been gone. Devastation. That's what Micah is saying. In verse 16, he indicates further the apostasy of Judah is such that they have walked in the way of Omri, who was the king of the northern kingdom, Israel, and in the way of the house of Ahab, who truly did not walk with God. I will make you a desolation, and your inhabitants a hissing. Now that phrase, I will make your inhabitants a hissing, does not mean that when Israel or Judah is laid waste by other nations, that people are going to cup their fingers together and do a like this. But rather, it describes a kind of fate which was common in Near Eastern experience to express, when one wanted to express horror at something which came before the eyes, which was too great for the senses to take in. One expelled a kind of a hissing expulsion of breath. The devastation which will come because of this kind of living will cause others to look in horror. Chapter 7, 1 through 7, still on this theme of denouncing Judah once more, Micah kind of summarizes and laments over his decadent society. He has come looking for fruit, summer fruit, and instead has found none. Everything has been harvested. There's nothing to satisfy his soul. He's like Jesus, who came expecting to find in Israel fruit on the vine, and instead found nothing. There is no righteousness. And in fact, the situation is so severe, as Micah contemplates the treachery and the betrayal in the town, that not only is the betrayal against God, but the betrayal is against someone else. So Micah has to give the counsel in verse 5 of chapter 7. Put no trust in a neighbor, and no confidence in a friend. Guard the doors of your mouth from her who lies in your bosom. In other words, don't even tell your wife your plans, because your wife will betray you. The son treats the father with contempt. The daughter rises against her mother. The daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are those of his own house. A time of betrayal. Time of great hurting. What will Micah say of this betrayal? What will his attitude be when you can trust no one else? He responds in verse 7. As for me, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. He will hope for the Lord. His pessimism in regard to others being true to him will not drive him into despair, but it will instead drive him into the arms of God. Something here really should illumine our mind. And that is how much the Scriptures were a comfort to Christ. Because Christ went through this very experience when he was betrayed by all, and when his enemies were those of his own house. To what in those moments did he turn for comfort and solace? We know that there was not the frequency of the audible voice of God coming from heaven assuring him. It only happened a couple of times in all of his ministry. He took his comfort from the Scripture. And in those moments when he was betrayed and alone, to whom did he look? I will watch and I will wait for the Lord. Good words for all of us. Finally, the book concludes in verses 8 through 20 with confident hopes and prayers. It is to better times that Micah looks in the last of his book. In verses 8 through 10, he gives a psalm of confidence, which is meant to be spoken by Zion. It is a song which, if you would go with me for a moment into a future worship scene, suppose for a moment that it is the beginning of the Lord's physical reign on earth, and the redeemed are back in Jerusalem. Suppose that the service is about ready to begin in that moment, which will honor the Lord. Do you know one of the hymns that the redeemed might be singing on that occasion? Could you imagine this being chanted or sung in unison? Rejoice not over me, O my enemy. When I fall, I shall rise. When I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me. Can you imagine today even how many in the world who are faithfully serving Christ are in effect sitting in darkness, who are left alone, who wonder if they have a friend on earth? To those who sit in darkness, there will be a light. To those who are fallen with weakness, they will arise. I will bear the indignation of the Lord. I have sinned against him. Until he pleads my cause and executes judgment for me, he will bring me forth to the light, and I shall behold his deliverance. And the hymn goes on to exalt in the fact that God will then bring low all of those who have sinned against him. In verses 11 through 13, Micah speaks on behalf of God to the people who have just sung the hymn, and he says to them, a day for building your walls. In that day the boundary shall be far extended. And here Micah says the ideal promise which God gave to Abraham, that his land would be from the Euphrates River to the Nile River, that it would cover all the expansive territory which is now Saudi Arabia and Israel and Jordan and Syria and Iraq and part of Iran and Egypt. All of that great multitude of land will now be his people, the redeemed, which I believe will both include Jews and Gentiles in God's new humanity. All of that will be given to them. And in verses 14 through 17, he gives a prayer of supplication. It is an exciting prayer, where he says to God, shepherd thy people with thy staff, the flock of thine inheritance, who now dwell alone in a forest, in the midst of a garden land. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, which were regions to the east of Jordan. By the way, when you look at modern events, you know the struggle Israel is having as a nation for the East Bank. And here we're talking about the East Bank. Let me feed again in Bashan and Gilead. As in the days when you came up out of the land of Egypt, I will show them marvelous things. The nation shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall lay their hands on their mouths. Their ears shall be deaf. They shall lick the dust like a serpent. An ancient reference to the fact that when a people became subservient to another, as a symbol of that subservience, a person put his neck on the ground and the conqueror lightly placed his foot over the neck. That is a descriptive of licking the dust. They shall come trembling out of their strongholds. They shall turn in dread to the Lord our God, and they shall fear because of thee. What has been going on? All the time, those without God have been saying, we would believe if we could see, and have refused to believe because they never saw in the way they wanted to see, in a physical way. Come down from the temple and save yourself. Come down from the cross, rather, and save yourself. Never having had an opportunity to see, now at last the tables are turned, and that which has been demanded is finally given, but too late. They shall see. This prayer of Micah is therefore similar in kind and spirit to the prayer of St. Paul when he acknowledges the time when every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Finally, in verses 18 through 20, a prayer of confidence, a hymn of praise, where Micah closes on a theme which points out the beauty of the nature of God. Who is a God like thee, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression and the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in hesed, steadfast love. He will again have compassion upon us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. Thou wilt cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. Thou wilt show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as thou hast sworn to our fathers from the days of old. Can you believe that God can utterly pass over your transgression? Utterly and completely no longer remember your failures. I've kind of had a policy for years in regard to students of mine, is when they're through with the course, I make it my intention to forget their grades. A student came to me last night at the wedding and apologetically informed me that they had been a member of a class of mine at one time, New Testament survey, and they were apologetic because evidently they'd gotten a bad grade. And I said, I don't remember it. God will look that way at us, all the things which we have done, to deeply disappoint Him, to disappoint deeply others, maybe even some things which we have done which no one else is even aware of. But God is willing, at our call, to bury it and to remember it no more. Thus Micah gives us an exalted understanding of God, an understanding of God which the Apostle Paul himself will call to mind and dwell upon in his letters of Romans and Galatians, where he will speak of the wonder that God has done for us in the vastness of His forgiveness. It was Martin Luther who, in commenting upon this passage, said, though great our sins and sore our wounds, and deep and dark our fall, His helping mercy hath no bounds, His love surpasseth all. Our trusty, loving shepherd He, who shall at last set Israel free from all their sin and sorrow. Let us just close with some moments of worship to the Lord.